September 2, 1945, Victory over Japan Day. Across America, sirens wailed in celebration and ticker tape rained down on jubilant crowds. In prisoner of war camps from California to Virginia, Japanese soldiers and support personnel prepared for repatriation to their defeated empire. But in a small facility outside San Diego, California, something unprecedented was happening. When American commanders announced to a group of 53 Japanese women prisoners that they were free to return home, many of them did the unthinkable. They hesitated. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the Japanese Women's Volunteer Corps, captured during the final months of the war in the Pacific. Young women who had served the emperor in various capacities, now facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. What could possibly make someone hesitate when offered freedom to return to their own country? Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 6 months earlier, but the moment that would change everything had already happened. It wasn't a dramatic battle or a political speech. It was something far simpler, far more unexpected. It was chocolate pudding. Commander Dorothy Brennan stood in her office that September morning, reviewing the repatriation orders with growing unease. She had overseen this facility since March, watching these Japanese women transform from terrified prisoners into something she had never anticipated. The official paperwork described them as enemy combatants to be processed and returned. But Dorothy knew better. She had seen what happened in the mess hall during their first week of captivity. She had witnessed the moment when everything changed. The women were gathered in the main assembly hall, sitting in neat rows as they had been taught. Their posture remained militarily precise, even after months in American custody, back straight and hands folded. But Dorothy noticed something different in their faces today. Where she expected to see relief at the news of repatriation, she saw conflict. Where she anticipated eagerness to return home, she observed anxiety. 24-year-old Michiko Hayashi sat in the third row, her fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of a small photograph she kept hidden in her pocket. It showed her family in Kyoto, taken before the war had consumed everything. Her parents, her younger brother, her grandmother in traditional dress. She had no way of knowing if any of them had survived the firebombing campaigns. The last letter she had received months ago described food shortages and constant fear. That letter had arrived the same week she first tasted chocolate pudding. The memory of that moment haunted her now as Commander Brennan began reading the official repatriation procedures. Michiko's mouth could still recall the sensation, sweet and rich and utterly foreign. She remembered how her hands had trembled as she held the bowl, how Fumiko Watanabe beside her had gasped at the first taste, how all of them, despite their training and discipline, had scraped their bowls clean. It was just dessert. But somehow it had become so much more. March 19, 1945. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of the San Diego facility, carrying 42 Japanese women who had been captured 3 weeks earlier during the liberation of the Philippines. They sat in tense silence, their faces masks of controlled fear beneath the canvas covering. Each woman had been prepared by their training to face torture, to endure humiliation, to die with honor rather than submit to the enemy. None of them had been prepared for what they were about to experience. Michiko Hayashi pressed herself against the truck's metal side, trying to steady her breathing. She had served as a communications operator for the Imperial Japanese Army, intercepting and translating Allied radio signals. When American forces overran her position outside Manila, she had expected immediate execution. Instead, she and 41 other women from various support units had been processed as prisoners of war and transported across the Pacific Ocean to California. The journey had taken 18 days. For the last 72 hours, they had received nothing but water and small portions of rice. The truck stopped. American voices shouted orders in English that most of the women couldn't understand. The canvas flap opened, revealing harsh California sunlight and the face of Commander Dorothy Brennan. She was a tall woman in her early 40s, her brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her expression professionally neutral. Behind her stood several American military police, both male and female, all armed. Michiko stepped down from the truck first, her legs unsteady after the long journey. She wore the remnants of her gray Volunteer Corps uniform, now stained and worn. Around her neck hung a small identification tag. In her pocket, she carried only that single photograph and a folded letter from her mother, dated November 1944. Everything else she had owned was gone, lost during the chaos of capture. The other women followed, forming an uncertain line in the compound's main yard. Fumiko Watanabe, a nurse from Osaka, stood beside Michiko with tears streaming silently down her face. Sachiko Endo, a radio operator like Michiko, maintained rigid military posture despite her obvious exhaustion. Noriko Kimura, Teruko Matsuda, and Emiko Okada clustered together, their eyes wide with fear as they surveyed their new prison. Commander Brennan began speaking in English, her words translated haltingly by a Japanese-American interpreter named Private Helen Kowalski. Helen's parents had immigrated to Pennsylvania before the war, and her accent carried traces of both languages. She looked uncomfortable with her role, translating orders that would govern these women's captivity. The rules were surprisingly simple. The women would be housed in barracks specifically prepared for female prisoners. They would maintain their quarters, follow a daily schedule, and perform light work assignments. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. They would not be harmed. Michiko listened to these words with deep suspicion. She had been taught that Americans were cruel, that they would violate and murder Japanese prisoners without mercy. Yet Commander Brennan's tone suggested something different. There was no hatred in her voice, no threat of violence, just professional distance and what might have been weariness. The women were led to their barracks, a long wooden building with rows of cots and thin blankets. It was sparse but clean, far better than the conditions they had endured during transport. Windows let in afternoon light. A small stove promised warmth against the cool California nights. At the far end sat a communal bathroom with running water. The first shock came at 1800 hours, when a bell rang across the compound, signaling the evening meal. The Japanese women had been given 30 minutes to wash and settle into their barracks before being escorted to the mess hall by Corporal Ruth Zimmerman, a stocky woman from Wisconsin whose face revealed nothing of her thoughts about her new charges. Michiko led the group, her stomach tight with anxiety and hunger. She expected minimal rations, perhaps watery soup and a small portion of rice if they were fortunate. During her service in the Philippines, even Japanese military personnel had faced increasing food shortages. Prisoners, she assumed, would receive far less. The mess hall doors opened to reveal something that made no sense. Long tables stretched across the room, and at each place setting sat a metal tray already filled with food. Not small portions, not meager rations, mountains of food that seemed impossible, wasteful, incomprehensible. Michiko stopped so abruptly that Fumiko nearly collided with her from behind. The other women crowded in the doorway, staring at the trays with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. Commander Brennan stood near the serving line with Sergeant Vincent Romano, the camp's head cook. Romano was a large man with thick forearms and a chef's apron stretched across his considerable frame. His family ran an Italian restaurant in Boston, and he had brought that philosophy to military cooking. He believed in feeding people properly, even prisoners. Private Helen Kowalski moved among the Japanese women, gently urging them to sit down. Her Japanese was formal and slightly awkward, but her meaning was clear. This food was for them. They were meant to eat it. Michiko moved to the nearest table and sat slowly, her eyes fixed on the tray before her. There was meat, actual meat. in portions she hadn't seen since before the war. Mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans, fresh bread with more butter on the side, a small container of milk. And at the corner of the tray, in a small white bowl, sat something dark and smooth that she didn't recognize. Around her, the other women settled into their seats with the same stunned silence. No one reached for their food. Years of discipline and caution held them frozen. Was this a test, a cruel joke before the real deprivation began? Would they be punished for eating without permission? Sergeant Romano noticed their hesitation and spoke to Commander Brennan in English. She nodded and addressed the women through Helen's translation. "You are required to eat. This is your meal. There is no trick. You will receive 3 meals like this every day." Michiko's hands trembled as she picked up her fork. She had not held Western utensils in months. Beside her, Sachiko Endo simply picked up the bread with her fingers and bit into it. Her eyes widened at the taste of fresh-baked wheat and real butter. That single gesture broke the paralysis. All 42 women began to eat. The meal was consumed in complete silence, except for the quiet sounds of utensils against metal trays. Michiko tasted each item carefully, her mind struggling to process the contradiction between what she had been taught to expect and what was actually happening. The meat was tender, the potatoes were rich with cream and butter, everything was warm, properly prepared, abundant. But it was that small white bowl that drew her attention again and again. She had saved it for last, uncertain what it contained. The substance was dark brown, almost black, with a glossy surface that caught the light. Michiko stared at the small white bowl for a long moment before lifting her spoon. The dark substance wobbled slightly, its surface catching the overhead lights of the mess hall. Around her, other women had also paused at this final item on their trays, equally uncertain about what they were seeing. Private Helen Kowalski noticed their hesitation and moved closer to Michiko's table. She pointed to the bowl and said a word in English that meant nothing to any of them. "Chocolate pudding." Then she made an exaggerated gesture of tasting something delicious, smiling encouragingly. Fumiko Watanabe, sitting across from Michiko, was the first to try it. She dipped her spoon into the pudding tentatively, lifting only a small amount to her lips. The moment it touched her tongue, her entire body went rigid. Her eyes widened in shock, then slowly closed. A sound escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a whimper. Michiko watched her friend's reaction with growing alarm. Was Fumiko in pain? Had the food been poisoned after all? But then Fumiko opened her eyes and Michiko saw tears streaming down her face. Not tears of agony, but something else entirely. Fumiko looked down at her bowl and took another spoonful, larger this time, and the same expression of overwhelming sensation crossed her features. Unable to resist any longer, Michiko lifted her own spoon to her mouth. The texture was unlike anything she had ever experienced, smooth and creamy in a way that seemed almost liquid yet somehow solid. But it was the taste that shattered every expectation she had carried into this moment. Sweet, impossibly, devastatingly sweet. Rich in a way that transcended simple sugar. There were layers to the flavor, complexities her inexperienced palate couldn't begin to identify. Chocolate, cream, vanilla, ingredients she had no names for in any language. Her throat tightened with emotion she couldn't control. In Kyoto, before the war, her family had sometimes enjoyed small sweets on special occasions. Red bean paste, rice cakes sweetened with limited sugar rations, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for this intensity of flavor. This was abundance made edible. This was a kind of prosperity she hadn't known existed. Around the mess hall, similar reactions rippled through the Japanese women. Sachiko Endo ate her pudding with methodical precision, but her hands shook with each spoonful. Noriko Kimura put her face in her hands and wept openly, while Teruko Matsuda sat frozen, her spoon halfway to her mouth, as if afraid that moving would break whatever spell had created this moment. Emiko Okada finished her entire bowl in what seemed like seconds, then stared at the empty dish with an expression of profound loss. Sergeant Romano watched from the serving line, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He had served this same chocolate pudding to American soldiers hundreds of times and never witnessed reactions like this. These women weren't just eating dessert. They were experiencing something that transcended food entirely. When the meal ended and the women filed back to their barracks, not a single bowl had been left with even a trace of pudding remaining. The chocolate pudding appeared again 3 days later at dinner, and this time the Japanese women's reaction was immediate. Michiko saw the small white bowls being placed on their trays and felt her heart race with an anticipation that shamed her. She was a prisoner of war, a servant of the emperor, yet here she sat, eagerly awaiting a dessert made by enemy hands. Private Helen Kowalski had been watching the women carefully since their arrival. Unlike the male guards who maintained professional distance, Helen felt an unexpected kinship with these prisoners. Her own parents had faced suspicion and hostility during the early war years simply for being Japanese American. She understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy while feeling like something else entirely. She approached Michiko's table carrying a serving pitcher. "More milk?" she asked in English, gesturing to the empty glasses. Michiko looked up at her blankly, not understanding the words. Helen tried again, this time mixing in simple Japanese phrases she had been practicing. "Miruku? More?" Michiko nodded hesitantly, and Helen poured. As she did, she pointed to the chocolate pudding and said slowly, "Chocolate pudding." She repeated it twice, waiting. Michiko attempted to echo the sounds, her pronunciation awkward. "Choco-re-to, puddingu." Helen smiled broadly. "Yes, chocolate pudding." She touched her own chest. "Helen." Then she pointed to Michiko expectantly. There was a long pause. Giving her name to an American guard felt like a betrayal of something essential, but the kindness in Helen's face was undeniable, and the chocolate pudding sat between them like a peace offering neither had asked for. "Michiko?" she said quietly. "Michiko," Helen repeated carefully, pronouncing it better than Michiko had expected. "Nice to meet you, Michiko." Over the following weeks, these small exchanges multiplied. Helen began bringing a notebook to meals, writing down English words and their Japanese equivalents. Other guards noticed, and some joined in, though most maintained their professional distance. Sergeant Vincent Romano started pointing to ingredients as he prepared meals, teaching vocabulary through the universal language of food. "Chocolate," he would say, holding up a brown bar. "Sugar, cream, vanilla." The women repeated the words, their accents thick, but their attention absolute. Learning English gave them something to focus on beyond their uncertain futures. Michiko discovered she had an aptitude for languages. Within a month, she could construct simple sentences. "Thank you for pudding" became her first complete English phrase, delivered to Sergeant Romano with a small bow that made the big cook's eyes water unexpectedly. But it was the pudding itself that continued to bridge the impossible gap between captor and captive. Twice weekly, those white bowls appeared, and twice weekly, the mess hall filled with a silence that spoke of something beyond mere eating. The Japanese women savored every spoonful with an intensity that transformed dessert into communion. Fumiko whispered to Michiko one evening in Japanese, "I dream about it now. Is that wrong?" Michiko had no answer. She dreamed about it too. May 19, 1945. A mail delivery arrived at the San Diego facility carrying the first letters the Japanese women had received since their capture. Commander Dorothy Brennan distributed them personally, watching as the prisoners tore open envelopes with trembling hands. Michiko received 2 letters. The first was from the International Red Cross, dated March 7th, informing her that they were attempting to locate her family in Kyoto. The second was from her mother, written in January, before the massive firebombing campaigns had intensified. The paper was thin, rationed, and her mother's handwriting wavered with exhaustion or hunger or both. "Dearest Michiko," it began in formal Japanese characters, "we have not heard from you in many months and pray daily for your safety. Food has become very scarce. Your grandmother passed in December from illness we could not treat. Your brother has been conscripted. We survive on rations that grow smaller each week. The city endures air raids regularly now. We sleep in shelters most nights. Your father says we must maintain honor and faith in final victory, but I confess my spirit weakens. I think of you constantly and hope you are somewhere safe." The letter ended there, as if her mother had run out of paper or strength or hope. Michiko read it 3 times, then sat motionless while around her other women reacted to their own correspondence. Fumiko Watanabe sobbed openly, her letter apparently containing news of deaths. Sachiko Endo stared at her unopened envelope as if afraid of what it might reveal. Noriko Kimura had received nothing at all. That evening at dinner, the contrast became unbearable. The American trays arrived with their usual abundance: roasted chicken, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and the twice-weekly appearance of chocolate pudding. Michiko looked down at her bowl and felt her stomach turn with guilt. While her mother starved in Kyoto, while her grandmother had died from treatable illness, while her younger brother faced conscription into a losing war, she sat in enemy captivity eating chocolate pudding. She pushed the bowl away untouched. Around her, other women made similar gestures. The joy they had found in this simple dessert now felt like betrayal. How could they savor sweetness while their families suffered deprivation they could barely imagine? Private Helen Kowalski noticed the change immediately. She approached Michiko's table, concern evident on her face. "Michiko, pudding no good?" Michiko struggled to find English words adequate to explain the complexity of her guilt. Finally, she managed, "Family. Japan. Hungry. I eat." Wrong. Helen's expression shifted to understanding. She sat down across from Michiko, breaking protocol by joining the prisoners at their table. She spoke slowly, carefully, mixing English and Japanese. "You eating doesn't make them more hungry. You not eating doesn't make them less hungry. War is terrible, but you must live." Michiko understood the words, but her heart rejected their logic. That night, she lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, while other women wept quietly in the darkness. June 4th, 1945. 3 weeks after the devastating letters arrived, Sergeant Vincent Romano made an unprecedented decision. He approached Commander Dorothy Brennan with a request that initially seemed absurd. He wanted to teach several Japanese prisoners how to make chocolate pudding. Dorothy had watched the women's spirits deteriorate since the mail delivery. They ate mechanically now, without joy. The pudding bowls often left half-finished. The guilt of abundance while their families starved had poisoned even this small pleasure. Romano believed that involving them in the creation might restore some sense of purpose and agency. "They need to do something with their hands besides grieve," he told Dorothy. "Let them cook. Let them learn. Let them feel useful." Dorothy approved the request with strict conditions. Only women who volunteered, only under close supervision, and only in small groups. To everyone's surprise, when Private Helen Kowalski announced the opportunity, 12 women immediately stepped forward. Michiko was among them. The following morning, 6 Japanese women stood in the military kitchen wearing borrowed aprons over their camp uniforms. Sergeant Romano had cleared his usual staff for the day, leaving only himself and Corporal Ruth Zimmerman present. The kitchen smelled of yeast and coffee and something sweet Michiko couldn't identify. Romano began by laying out ingredients on the long steel counter: cocoa powder, sugar, cornstarch, milk, vanilla extract, salt, butter. He spoke each word slowly in English while Helen translated. Then he demonstrated measuring, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he leveled each cup and spoon with precision. "Cooking is mathematics," he said through Helen's translation. Exact amounts, exact temperatures, exact timing, like radio signals, yes? He looked at Michiko, knowing her background as a communications operator. Michiko nodded, understanding the parallel. There was comfort in precision, in following a formula that produced predictable results. She watched as Romano combined the dry ingredients in a heavy saucepan, then gradually whisked in milk until the mixture was smooth. He explained each step twice, making sure everyone understood before proceeding. The women took turns stirring the mixture over medium heat. Fumiko was first, her hand uncertain on the whisk, until Romano gently corrected her technique. Constant motion, he demonstrated. Never stop, or it burns. Sachiko went next, then Noriko, each woman focusing intently on the simple task of stirring chocolate into existence. When the pudding thickened and Romano added butter and vanilla, the kitchen filled with an aroma that made Michiko's throat tighten. This was the smell that had haunted her dreams. Now she understood its origins, could name its components, could theoretically recreate it herself. Romano poured the finished pudding into individual bowls and placed them in the refrigerator. "We wait 2 hours for cold," he said. Then he looked at each woman seriously. "You made this, your hands, your work. When you eat later, remember that." When the pudding had chilled and the women tasted what they themselves had created, Michiko found she could swallow without guilt for the first time in weeks. August 15th, 1945. The announcement came through radio broadcast at noon Pacific time. Emperor Hirohito's voice, thin and crackling with static, delivered words that most Japanese people had never heard their divine ruler speak before. Japan was surrendering. The war was over. In the San Diego facility, the 53 Japanese women gathered around a radio that Commander Dorothy Brennan had brought into the common room, Private Helen. Kowalski translated the Emperor's formal language into simpler Japanese, though most of the women understood enough of the archaic phrasing to grasp the essential truth. Their nation had been defeated. The cause they had served no longer existed. The reactions varied dramatically. Some women wept with relief that the killing would finally stop. Others sat in stunned silence, their faces blank with shock. A few, including Sachiko Endo, appeared almost angry, as if surrender represented a personal betrayal. Michiko felt nothing at first, just a strange numbness that spread through her chest and limbs. Surrender meant repatriation. It meant going home. It meant this strange interlude of captivity, chocolate pudding, and unexpected kindness would end. She should have felt joy. Instead, she felt terror. That evening, the women gathered in small groups throughout the barracks, speaking in urgent whispers. Fumiko approached Michiko's bunk after lights out, settling beside her in the darkness. "What will we return to?" she asked quietly. "My entire family is dead. My city is rubble. What home exists for me in Japan?" Michiko had no answer. Her own situation was equally uncertain. The last letter from her mother was 7 months old. Kyoto had been spared the worst of the firebombing, but who knew what had happened since January? Her brother might be dead. Her parents might be dead. She might return to find nothing and no one waiting. "Here, we have purpose," Fumiko continued. "Sergeant Romano teaches us cooking. Private Kowalski teaches us English. We work in the laundry, in the gardens, in the administrative offices. We eat 3 meals every day. We are treated with dignity." She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "In Japan, we will be failures, prisoners who surrendered, women who were corrupted by American kindness." Over the next 2 weeks, these conversations intensified. The women debated in Japanese during their free hours, weighing impossible choices. Return to a devastated homeland where food was scarce and their reputations were ruined, or somehow, impossibly, find a way to remain in the country that had defeated them. 18 women, including Michiko and Fumiko, began meeting secretly after evening meals. They discussed the unthinkable, requesting to stay. The idea seemed absurd, unprecedented, perhaps even treasonous. But the alternative felt equally impossible. On August 28th, Michiko wrote a letter to Commander Brennan in careful English, requesting a private meeting. 16 other women signed their names below hers. The 18th, Noriko Kimura, would add her name later after 2 more days of agonizing deliberation. They had made their decision. Now they had to find the courage to speak it aloud. September 5, 1945. Commander Dorothy Brennan called a general assembly for all Japanese prisoners to announce official repatriation procedures. The 53 women gathered in the main hall, their faces reflecting months of transformation that Dorothy had witnessed but never fully understood. She stood before them, holding documents from the War Department, aware that this moment should bring relief and closure. Lieutenant George Caldwell stood beside her, along with Private Helen Kowalski, who would translate. Sergeant Vincent Romano had asked permission to attend and stood near the back wall, his arms crossed over his chef's apron. He had grown unexpectedly attached to these women, who had learned to make his chocolate pudding. Dorothy began speaking in her clear, professional voice. "Ladies, I have received official orders regarding your repatriation to Japan. Transportation has been arranged for September 22nd. You will be processed through displaced persons facilities in Tokyo before being released to return to your families and homes." She paused, observing the mixture of resignation and anxiety on their faces. What happened next, Dorothy would later tell her superiors, was the most surprising moment of her 20-year military career. Michiko Hayashi stood slowly, her hands visibly shaking. She had rehearsed this moment dozens of times in English, practicing the words with Helen's help during their language lessons. But now, facing the actual confrontation, her throat felt tight with fear. In clear, careful English, she addressed the commander directly. "Commander Brennan, may I speak for some of us?" Dorothy nodded, surprised. Permission granted. Michiko looked around at the 17 women who had agreed to stand with her. Fumiko Watanabe rose first, followed by Sachiko Endo, then Noriko Kimura, Teruko Matsuda, Emiko Okada, and 12 others. They formed a small group within the larger assembly, their decision visible to everyone present. "We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks," Michiko began, her accent thick but her words precise. Some of us do not wish to return to Japan immediately." The statement hung in the air like smoke. The American staff exchanged confused glances. Several Japanese women who had not joined the standing group gasped audibly. Dorothy felt her carefully prepared speech dissolve into irrelevance. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "You're saying you want to remain here? As prisoners?" Fumiko spoke next, her English less polished than Michiko's, but equally determined. "Not prisoners. We know war is finished. We know we should go home. But—" her voice broke slightly. "Japan is not home anymore. The Japan we served, we discovered, was not the Japan we believed." Sachiko stepped forward, her military bearing still evident despite months in captivity. "Families dead, cities destroyed. We return to nothing. Here we have found something we never expected." Michiko continued, finding strength in her companion's support. "You gave us food when we expected starvation. You taught us language when we expected silence. You showed us kindness when we expected cruelty." She paused, searching for the right words. Chocolate pudding was first American thing we tasted. It was sweet when we expected bitter. 23 years after that unprecedented day, when 18 Japanese women prisoners requested to remain in American custody, Michiko Hayashi Kowalski stood before a gathering at the Japanese American Cultural Center in Los Angeles. She had been invited to speak about reconciliation and the power of small gestures to overcome historical hatred. Now an American citizen with 2 grown children, she carried with her a small white bowl identical to the ones used in the San Diego facility. Her speech that day would be remembered as one of the most moving testimonies about the transformative power of unexpected kindness. She spoke about the morning when Commander Dorothy Brennan announced their repatriation, and how that announcement had forced them to confront the most important question of their lives. What did home truly mean when everything you knew had been destroyed? "We discovered," she told the audience in fluent English with only traces of her Japanese accent remaining, "that home is not just where you come from. It is where you choose to build a life that honors human dignity. We found that enemies can become friends when both sides choose compassion over hatred." The bureaucratic process of reclassifying 18 enemy prisoners as displaced persons seeking asylum had taken 4 months. Commander Brennan had advocated tirelessly, writing dozens of letters to War Department officials. Sergeant Vincent Romano had organized local families willing to sponsor the women. Private Helen Kowalski, whose own family understood the complexity of Japanese-American identity, had helped navigate the cultural barriers. Of the 18 who had chosen to stay, 16 eventually became American citizens. 2 returned to Japan after 5 years, homesickness finally overcoming their fear. But all of them carried forward the lessons learned in that San Diego facility where chocolate pudding had become a bridge between enemies. Fumiko Watanabe had married an American doctor and opened a nursing school that emphasized compassionate care regardless of a patient's background. Sachiko Endo became a translator for the State Department, helping to rebuild diplomatic relations between America and Japan. Noriko Kimura taught Japanese language at the University of California, always beginning her first class by explaining that language was a tool for building understanding, not maintaining division. The 35 women who had chosen immediate repatriation in 1945 had played their own crucial role. They returned to devastated Japan carrying stories of American kindness that helped convince other Japanese citizens that their former enemies could be trusted. Several became leaders in reconstruction efforts, applying lessons learned about dignity and second chances. Michiko concluded her speech by holding up the white bowl she had brought to the podium. Inside was chocolate pudding made from Sergeant Romano's exact recipe that she had memorized 23 years earlier. "This dessert taught me that sweetness can exist even in the bitterest circumstances," she said. "We licked those bowls clean, not because we were starving for food, but because we were starving for hope, for kindness, for proof that the world contained more than hatred and war." The story of the Japanese women who chose to stay reminds us that transformation is possible when people are offered dignity instead of degradation, opportunity instead of punishment, chocolate pudding instead of starvation rations.